At 8:26 p.m., the driveway held the last blue of evening. The porch light was already on, and the hallway inside stayed lit a little longer than it needed to. He sat beside the steering wheel with his hands open, no longer the plant manager, not only the grandparent either, but someone paused between two responsibilities. In his palm was the worn house key, the one he had been given years ago without much ceremony. It had always seemed practical. A way in. A small metal answer to a locked door. But tonight, after visiting his parent and hearing the room settle around them, the key felt different. Not heavier. Maybe only clearer. Some kinds of care do not ask to be noticed when they are happening. They simply stay, wearing down quietly in the hand, until the day finally lets them be seen. The visit had not been long, not in the way people count time. A little over an hour, maybe. Enough for the porch light to come on by itself. Enough for the street to lose its afternoon edges. Enough for the house to begin making those small evening sounds it had always made, long before anyone thought to call them memory. He had checked the thermostat before leaving. He had looked once at the back door, then at the little stack of mail near the wall. He had asked whether the trash needed to go out, though he already knew the answer, because some questions are not really questions. They are a way of standing nearby without making the room feel watched. His parent had said no. Then maybe yes. Then no again. He had smiled a little, the tired smile he used at the plant when a machine was almost running right but still needed a hand near it. He knew that kind of waiting. The kind where nothing is broken enough to call for help, but nothing feels finished either. Now he was in the driveway, sitting behind the wheel. The engine was off. The windshield held a thin reflection of the porch light, blurred by dust and old wiper marks. Down the block, a neighbor's garage door lowered with a tired groan. Somewhere inside the house, maybe the refrigerator started again, or a pipe settled in the wall. It was the kind of sound nobody mentions until a room becomes quiet enough to hear it. His phone lay in the cup holder, face down. His work badge was still clipped to his jacket, though he had left the plant hours ago. It hung there like proof of one life, while the key in his palm belonged to another. He had not noticed the weight of both before. Or maybe he had, and had moved too quickly to name it. He was a plant manager. People asked him where things were, when things would ship, why the line had stopped, who could cover the late shift, whether the parts had come in, whether the new guy understood the lockout procedure. All day, doors opened because someone expected him to know which one. And now, in the dim driveway, he held a different key. This one was small. Ordinary brass, dulled at the edges. The teeth were worn smooth in places from years of turning in the same lock. It had sat on his key ring so long that it had become almost invisible. One of those objects the hand knows before the mind looks down. It had been given to him years ago. There had not been a speech with it. No careful moment at the kitchen table. No big family conversation about trust, age, change, or what would happen later. His parent had just placed it in his hand one afternoon and said something simple, something almost practical. In case you ever need it. At the time, he had nodded. He had probably been busy. There was always a shift to check on, a school event to get to, a lawn to mow, groceries in the back seat, someone waiting for a call back. He had taken the key and added it to the ring, maybe without even stopping at the car before thinking of the next thing. That was how care often entered his life then. Not as a feeling. As an item to carry. A lunch packed before dawn. A porch light left on. A spare blanket in the hall closet. A $5 bill folded into a birthday card long after he had his own paycheck. A phone call that began with, "I don't need anything," and then became 10 small things. He had not missed all of it. He was not that unseeing. But he had been young enough, and tired enough, and responsible enough in his own way, to think care was simply part of the furniture of life. Something already there. Something sturdy. Something that would keep standing while everyone came and went. The key rested across the lines of his palm. Inside the house, the hallway light stayed on. That light reached only so far. It touched the porch rail, the step, the narrow strip beside the door where leaves gathered when the wind came from the west. It did not reach the driveway fully. It did not reach the inside of the car, or the work badge on his jacket, or the place where his shoulders were slowly dropping now that no one was asking him anything. Most of life happened there, he thought. Not in the bright room. Not where people took pictures on holidays. But in the unphotographed places. Beside the steering wheel. Near a front door. In the small pause after someone says they are fine, and before anyone quite believes it. He sat a little longer. Not because he was avoiding the door. Because something in him had finally arrived later than his body. He had become used to entering rooms with a list already forming in his head. At the plant, he could walk across the floor and hear when a motor was running slightly off. He knew the sound of a forklift backing up before he turned to see it. He knew which door stuck when the weather changed, which supervisor needed a minute before bad news, which machine could be coaxed through one more hour and which one needed to be stopped before it made trouble for everyone. That kind of knowing followed him home. It followed him into the driveway, into the visit, into the front hallway where his parent had left a pair of shoes neatly beside the mat. He noticed the rug curled at one corner. He noticed the porch bulb was still working. He noticed the little bowl on the table where loose change and old keys had always gathered, though there were fewer keys there now. The house had changed quietly. Not all at once. Houses rarely do. They change in small, almost polite ways. A chair moves closer to the window. A handrail appears near the back steps. The heavy cookware gets shifted to a lower cabinet. The answering machine disappears, then the landline, then the stack of paper calendars that used to hang near the kitchen. But some things remained. The smell near the coat closet. The worn place in the floor where people turned toward the kitchen. The sound of the hallway light clicking on, then humming for a second before it steadied. The slight drag of the front door when it opened, as if the house still wanted to make sure whoever entered had meant to come in. He had used the key earlier that evening. His parent had been slow getting to the door, and he had called out first, then waited. When no answer came right away, he had put the key in the lock. The metal turned with the same old resistance. Not difficult, just familiar. The door opened into the quiet smell of dinner already finished, dish soap, and something soft cooling on the stove. There had been no emergency. Only age moving at its own pace. His parent had been in the back room, trying to fold a blanket that did not want to fold evenly. They looked up, half embarrassed, half relieved, and said they had been coming. He said he knew. Then he stepped inside like he had stepped inside 1,000 times before, though something about this time was not the same. The key had not felt like permission then. It had felt like trust. And maybe that was what he was only understanding now, parked in the driveway with both hands resting still. Years ago, when that key was placed in his palm, it had not only been for locked doors. It had been a quiet handing over of nearness. A way of saying, there may come a day when you will have to enter without being invited loudly. There may come a day when love sounds like the small turn of metal. No one had called it that. No one would have wanted to. In his family, Care often wore plain clothes. It came as a ride to the airport before sunrise. It came as gas in the tank. It came as someone saving boxes in the garage because one of the kids might need them for a move someday. It came as leftovers wrapped in foil, a driveway shoveled before work, a tire gauge kept in the glove compartment, a light left on long after everyone knew the way. When he was younger, he had sometimes mistaken quiet care for habit. Now, with grandchildren of his own, he understood habit differently. He understood how many times a person repeats a small act before anyone calls it love. He understood the tiredness in making sure there was milk in the refrigerator, batteries in the drawer, a clean towel ready, a door unlocked at the right hour. The house watched without speaking. The porch light held its small circle on the steps. Beyond it, the windows showed only pieces of rooms, not enough to tell the whole story. A lamp near the front room. A shadow from the curtain. The hallway light, still on, as if the house had not fully let go of the visit. He looked at the key again. Its brass had darkened near the head where fingers had touched it over the years. His fingers. His parents' fingers, once. Maybe hands before theirs, if the key had been copied from another old key and carried forward without anyone thinking much about it. Small things carry more than they say. He closed his hand around it, not tightly. Just enough to feel the shape. For a moment, there was no plant floor, no schedule, no next call, no one waiting for him to know what should happen. There was only the driveway, the quiet house, and a piece of metal that had outlasted the easy years. His shoulders lowered another inch. Then he breathed as if someone had finally stopped holding the door open from the other side. A few minutes passed before he moved. The clock on the dashboard still read 8:26, though he knew it had probably been 8:26 for longer than a minute. Sometimes the car clock lagged after the battery had been changed. Sometimes time itself seemed to do that in the driveway of a parent's house. It stayed in one place until the body caught up. He let the key rest against his thumb. There was a small nick near the top, where the brass had been scraped by years of other keys. It was not something anyone would notice unless they were sitting still enough. He had probably touched that nick hundreds of times in grocery store parking lots, at the plant gate, at home with his grandchildren waiting by the door. The hand had known it, even when he did not. That was the strange part. The hand remembers before the mind does. He thought of his parents' hand, not as it was now, thinner and slower over the folded blanket, but as it had been when he was young. Reaching into a coat pocket. Turning off a stove burner. Holding the steering wheel with one wrist while the other hand reached across the seat to keep him from sliding forward during a sudden stop. A small protection, done without words. He had not thought of that in years. It came back because of the key, maybe. Or because the hallway light was still on. Or because the day had finally lowered its voice enough for an old memory to step forward without asking permission. He had spent so much of his life learning how to be useful. At work, usefulness had a shape. A schedule posted on the wall. A clipboard. A decision made before the delay spread. Someone needed to know who was absent, which truck was late, which order had priority, which part could be substituted, which mistake needed correcting without making a person feel small. At home, usefulness had another shape. A toy fixed before a child lost patience. A driveway cleared. A bill paid. A ride offered. A hand on a small shoulder at a crowded restaurant. A grandchild lifted from the car seat, half asleep and warm against his jacket. He had trusted those shapes. They kept life moving. But sitting there, with the worn key in his palm, he could feel the part of care that did not move anything forward. The part that only remained available. The quiet promise of a house key on a ring. The permission to come in. The strange tenderness of being trusted with someone's ordinary rooms. Not the polished rooms. Not the holiday table. Not the places where everyone smiles for a picture before the food gets cold. The real rooms. The corner with the mail stacked too high. The sink with one glass left from lunch. The hallway where the light stayed on because someone had not yet made it back to turn it off. The bedroom door left half open. The blanket that would not fold evenly. The small evidence that a person was still living, still managing, still trying not to make too much of what had become harder. Respect arrived quietly. It did not feel like sadness exactly. It did not feel like guilt, though guilt knew the driveway and could have found its way there easily. It was something steadier than that. A kind of standing back inside himself and seeing the old care without needing to correct the years when he had not seen it fully. His parent had never asked for applause. Maybe that was why it had taken so long. So much care in his life had been done in the plainest way possible. The kind that could be mistaken for someone's personality. They were just like that, people said. They kept extra batteries. They saved receipts. They remembered who liked the heel of the bread and who did not. They put a lamp on before evening. They made sure the spare key worked. He looked toward the house. From the driveway, only one front window was visible, and even that showed mostly reflected porch light. The home looked smaller than it had when he was young. Or maybe he was seeing it from a different height now, from the seat of a car he did not want to leave too quickly. Inside, his parent was probably moving through the room slowly. Maybe turning down the thermostat. Maybe rinsing the cup he had used. Maybe standing for a second in the kitchen, hand on the counter, listening to the same house he was listening to from outside. Two people, separated by a door. Both pretending the visit had ended cleanly. He closed his eyes once, then opened them again. Not to make anything deeper. Only because his eyes were tired, and the quiet had given them permission to rest. The key warmed in his hand. The house had always had a way of continuing after people left. When he was a boy, he used to notice it from the back seat of the car, looking through the front window after some family dinner or late Sunday visit. The adults would stand in the doorway for a few extra minutes, still talking even after everyone had said goodbye. Someone would wave from inside. Someone would remind someone else to drive safe. Then the door would close, and the light would remain. He had not understood then how much tenderness could live in a light left on. Back then, lights were just lights. Keys were just keys. A parent checking the lock twice was only a parent being careful. A packed bag by the door was only a bag. A house that stayed awake until everyone got home was simply the kind of house he happened to live in. Life gives certain things names too late. He turned the key slowly between two fingers. The brass edge caught the glow from the porch, then disappeared into shadow again. It looked like nothing special. The kind of key a person could have copied at a hardware store while waiting near the paint counter, listening to the little machine grind its shape into a blank piece of metal. A quick errand. A small receipt. A key dropped into a palm with almost no ceremony. But most of what had held him had arrived that way. Plainly. Without asking to be remembered. He thought of his parent years earlier, handing him the key while standing near the kitchen doorway. Maybe the television had been on in the other room. Maybe there were dishes drying beside the sink. Maybe someone had been waiting outside, or the phone had rung, or the whole moment had passed under the noise of a regular day. That was the part that stayed with him now. The regularness of it. No one knew which ordinary moment would matter later. The handoff had probably taken less than 10 seconds. A key, a sentence, a nod. In case you ever need it. But beneath those words had been something wider, something his younger self had not had room to feel. Not because he was careless. He had simply been living forward, the way people do when there are children to raise, shifts to cover, tires to rotate, appointments to make, and groceries that spoil if left too long in the trunk. Now the day had slowed enough to turn around. He could see the care from another side. He had become the one leaving lights on. The one checking whether a door latched. The one keeping a spare sweatshirt in the back of the car for a grandchild who said they were not cold until they were. The one saving a few extra paper plates in the cabinet because family might come by after a game. The one standing at the edge of a room, counting quietly, making sure everyone had what they needed before he sat down. No applause came for these things. It would have embarrassed him if it had. And maybe that was why his respect felt so quiet now. It did not rise up like a speech. It did not need to be said out loud in the driveway. It was more like the way his shoulders lowered, the way his thumb stayed on the worn place of the key, the way he let the silence have a little space instead of filling it with the next task. The porch light hummed faintly. Somewhere beyond the house, a car passed on the main road, slow and distant. The tires made a soft sound over the pavement, then faded. A dog barked once behind a fence and then seemed to think better of it. The neighborhood returned to itself. He had spent the whole day answering to noise. Machines. Radios. A pallet jack rattling over a rough patch of floor. A phone call from a supplier. A question from his daughter about the weekend. A small voice from one of the grandkids asking whether he was coming to the school thing next Thursday. Each sound had pulled him into a different version of himself. Here, nobody was pulling. The house kept its quiet witness. He looked again at the front door and imagined the path inside. The step. The mat. The hallway. The place where the light spilled across one side of the wall. The room no one photographed, where coats hung unevenly and the air always held a trace of old wood, soap, and time. That was where care lived most honestly. Not arranged. Not announced. Just there. He placed the key back against the ring but did not start the car. Not yet. His hand rested on his knee. His breathing had finally slowed enough to feel like his own. For once, the useful thing was to remain still. At last, he opened the car door. The small dome light came on above him, pale and brief, making the driveway look colder than it was. He sat there with one foot on the pavement and one still inside the car, halfway out of the day, halfway inside whatever waited next. The air smelled faintly of cut grass, warm asphalt, and the dust that rises after a neighborhood has been quiet for a while. He did not hurry. The key ring made a small sound when he lifted it from his lap. Not loud. Just enough to mark the movement. The worn house key touched the others, his own front door key, the truck key, a small fob from the plant, the little plastic tag from the hardware store that had been unreadable for years. A life could gather like that. One ring. Different doors. Different versions of being needed. He stepped out and stood beside the open door for a moment. His knees felt the day before the rest of him did. The plant floor still lived in his legs, in the places where standing too long became normal. The visit lived somewhere higher, near the chest, quiet and not quite settled. The porch light remained ahead of him. It made the front step look almost careful, like the house had placed a small hand there and left it open. He closed the car door softly, not wanting the sound to travel through the windows. That was an old habit from raising children, from coming home late, from knowing that a house at night has its own thin peace. The door clicked shut. Inside, the hallway light still burned. He could see it through the narrow glass beside the door. A plain light, nothing pretty. It showed the edge of the wall, a hook with a jacket hanging from it, the little part of the room no one ever thought to photograph. Not the birthdays. Not the holidays. Not the table with everyone gathered. Just the passage between rooms. The place where people arrived and left. The place where someone stood with groceries cutting into their fingers, or shoes half on, or a coat not yet zipped. The place where a parent once called after him to take care, and he had answered from already outside, already thinking of the road. He walked toward it slowly. Each step made the key press against his palm. He could have put it in his pocket, but he did not. He let it stay there, visible and small, as if carrying it openly for these few feet made something in him more honest. The key had opened the door earlier, But now it seemed to open a different part of the evening. Not a locked room. Not exactly memory. Only room enough to see what had remained. There was the care that had not made a speech. There was the trust that had been handed over like an errand. There was the old house, changed and still itself. There was his parent inside, moving more slowly now, and there was himself outside, older than he felt in certain moments, younger than he wanted to admit in others. Between them was a door. And for once, the door did not feel like separation. It felt like the thin place where all the quiet years had gathered. He reached the step and paused again. The porch boards gave slightly under his weight. He knew that give. It had been there for years, maybe decades, and nobody had fixed it because it was not really broken. It simply answered when stepped on. Like some people. Like some parts of a family. Giving a little, holding anyway. He looked back toward the driveway. His car sat in the half-dark, work badge inside, phone still face down. Tomorrow would ask for him. The plant would ask. His children would ask in their ordinary ways. His grandchildren would ask without knowing they were asking. Life would keep handing him doors and small decisions and the need to be present in more than one place. But not yet. For this breath, there was only the porch light, the house key, the hallway holding its small glow. He put the key into the lock, then stopped before turning it. His shoulders settled first. That was the quiet mercy of the moment. Nothing had been fixed. Nothing had been explained. But the body had lowered enough to enter without carrying the whole day in both hands. He turned the key. The lock gave with its old familiar resistance, and the door opened into the soft, ordinary light. Inside, the house did not brighten all at once. It opened slowly, the way familiar places do at night. The hallway light touched the floor, the baseboard, the pair of shoes by the wall. Somewhere deeper in the house, water moved softly through a pipe, then stopped. He stood there with the key still in his hand. His parent called from another room, not loudly, just enough to know he had come back in. He answered in the same low voice. Nothing more was needed for a moment. The door rested behind him. The porch light kept shining outside, over the step, over the quiet driveway, over the part of the evening he had needed before entering. He slipped the key back onto the ring. It made one small sound, then settled among the others. And what remained was not large. Only care, still here. Only the light, left on.